There is a quiet truth that most people spend their entire lives circling without ever fully seeing. The moment someone stops needing you is the moment you finally see who you are without them. It doesn't arrive like a storm. There's no dramatic warning, no visible fracture, no scene that would make sense to anyone watching from the outside. It happens beneath the surface, in the space where exhaustion finally outweighs hope. And when that shift happens inside an empath, something irreversible begins. Because for so long they were not just feeling their own emotions, they were carrying someone else's too, translating silence into meaning, turning fragments into something whole, giving endlessly without asking whether anything real was being returned. And the one receiving all of that, the narcissist, never had to question it. It was simply there, constant, reliable, almost invisible in its consistency. But the moment that flow stops, the entire dynamic begins to unravel in ways neither of them expected. The empath doesn't explode. They don't accuse. They don't even explain the way they used to. Something far more unsettling happens. They go quiet in a way that isn't wounded anymore. It's not the silence of pain, it's the silence of completion. And that is the moment everything changes, even if it doesn't look like it yet. At first, the narcissist doesn't recognize what's happening. Why would they? This isn't how things have ever worked before. There's always been a pattern, an argument, a misunderstanding, a withdrawal, and then the return. The empath always came back, always tried again, always found a way to reopen what had been closed. So when the energy shifts this time, it's easy to misread. The silence feels familiar on the surface, but something underneath it feels. There's no urgency in it, no emotional pull, no invisible thread drawing things back together. And still, the narcissist assumes it's temporary. They believe this is just another phase in a cycle they've come to rely on. But what they don't realize is that the cycle has already been broken. Not loudly, not dramatically, but definitively. The empath is no longer participating in the same reality. They're no longer trying to be understood by someone who never truly listened. They're no longer shaping themselves into something more acceptable, more patient, more forgiving. And because the narcissist is so accustomed to emotional reactions, the absence of one feels like a delay, not a conclusion. They wait for the familiar spark, the explanation, the emotional plea, the attempt to reconnect, but it doesn't come. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, confusion begins to take root. What looks like detachment from the outside is actually the result of a long, invisible journey. The empath didn't wake up one day and decide to stop caring. It wasn't sudden. It was built over time, layer by layer, moment by moment, disappointment by disappointment. Every time they chose understanding over confrontation. Every time they excused behavior that didn't make sense. Every time they stayed when leaving would have been easier, they were stretching themselves further than they realized. And eventually there comes a point where something inside them reaches its limit, not in anger but in clarity. They begin to see the pattern not as something to fix, but as something to step away from. And when that realization settles in, it doesn't create chaos, it creates calm. A kind of stillness that feels foreign at first, because it's no longer driven by someone else's emotional demands. The empath stops reacting, not because they don't feel, but because they finally understand. They understand that their energy has been misplaced, that their empathy has been used as a resource rather than valued as a connection. And so they withdraw, not dramatically, not cruelly, but completely. And that withdrawal creates a space the narcissist doesn't know how to navigate. Without the empath's responses, the narcissist begins to feel something they're not used to feeling: exposure. For so long, their words and actions were met with emotion, with engagement, with some form of feedback that kept the dynamic alive. Even conflict served a purpose, because it meant there was still energy to work with, still something to shape and control. But now, there's nothing. No reaction, no resistance, no attempt to fix or explain. It's like speaking into a void that doesn't echo back. And that absence is deeply unsettling, because it removes the very thing the narcissist has been relying on to define the interaction. Their usual strategies begin to lose their impact. Charm feels flat. Guilt falls unnoticed. Even anger doesn't provoke the same response. And in that space where influence once existed, there is now uncertainty. The narcissist may not immediately recognize it as such, but what they are experiencing is the loss of control. And for someone whose identity is built around maintaining that control, even a small crack in it can feel destabilizing. They begin to push harder, subtly at first, testing, probing, trying to find the point where the empath will react again. But the more they push, the clearer it becomes. Something fundamental has changed. Control was never just a behavior, it was a structure. It shaped how the narcissist interacted, how they understood relationships, how they maintained their sense of self. And that structure depended on one crucial element: participation. As long as the empath engaged, whether through love, frustration, or even pain, the system worked. But now, with that participation gone, the structure starts to weaken. The narcissist may respond by escalating their efforts, becoming more intense, more persistent, more unpredictable. They might revisit old dynamics, bring up past connections, attempt to recreate moments that once worked. There can be sudden shifts in tone, warmth followed by coldness, vulnerability followed by distance, all designed to pull the empath back into the emotional exchange. But none of it lands the same way anymore, because the empath is no longer looking for resolution within that space. They've stepped outside of it entirely. And this is where the real shift begins, not just in behavior but in identity. The narcissist is faced with something they rarely encounter, a situation they cannot control through familiar means. And in that unfamiliar territory, something begins to surface beneath the surface reactions. It's not immediately visible, and it doesn't come with clarity. But it's there, a quiet, growing realization that the dynamic they depended on is no longer accessible. And without it, they are left to confront something they've spent a long time avoiding themselves. And what begins to surface in that silence is not something the narcissist can easily name, because it doesn't come in the form of a clear thought or a sudden realization. It arrives as a feeling first, an unease that doesn't quite make sense. It lingers in the moments where there used to be certainty, in the spaces where control once felt effortless. There is a subtle disorientation in no longer knowing how to pull someone back in, how to recreate the familiar emotional rhythm that once defined everything. And that disorientation slowly turns into frustration, because the rules they've relied on no longer seem to apply. They may start to replay past interactions in their mind, searching for a point where things shifted, trying to identify the exact moment the empath changed. But what they failed to see is that this wasn't a single moment, it was a slow accumulation, a quiet buildup that reached a threshold they never noticed. So instead of understanding, they react. They begin testing different approaches, sometimes becoming more charming than ever before, almost exaggerated in their warmth, as if trying to remind the empath of who they used to be together. Other times they turn sharp, distant, or even dismissive, hoping that a sudden withdrawal will provoke the empath into chasing again. But none of it works the same way, and that failure doesn't just confuse them, it unsettles them at a deeper level, because it challenges something fundamental, the belief that they can always influence the outcome. As the frustration builds, it begins to reveal something else beneath it, a kind of emptiness that has always been there but was never fully exposed. The empath's presence used to fill that space in ways the narcissist didn't consciously recognize. It wasn't just attention or validation, it was the sense of being seen, of being engaged with on a level that made everything feel more real, more anchored. And now that it's gone, there's a noticeable absence, like a room that suddenly feels larger and colder without the person who used to occupy it. This is where the narcissist starts to feel the loss, not just as a disruption, but as a void. And the instinctive response to that void is not reflection, it's replacement. They may begin to seek out new connections quickly, looking for someone who can restore that sense of engagement, someone who will respond, react, and participate in the same way the empath once did. At first, this might seem to work. The attention returns, the dynamic begins again, and for a moment it feels like everything is back in place. But something is different this time, even if they can't fully articulate it. The depth isn't the same. The connection feels thinner, more surface level. And while the pattern can be recreated, the intensity that once came from the empath's genuine emotional presence is harder to replicate. There is a subtle dissatisfaction that lingers, a sense that something essential is missing, even when everything appears to be functioning as it always has. Meanwhile, the empath is moving through a completely different experience, one that feels almost unreal at first because of how unfamiliar it is. Without the constant pull of someone else's emotional needs, there is a sudden stillness in their world. At first, that stillness can feel uncomfortable, even unsettling, because they've spent so long in a state of emotional motion, always thinking, always feeling, always responding. But gradually, that discomfort begins to shift into something else. It becomes space. Space to think clearly, to feel without interference, to exist without constantly adjusting themselves to someone else's expectations. And within that space, something begins to rebuild, not quickly, not perfectly, but steadily. The empath starts to reconnect with parts of themselves that had been quiet for a long time. They begin to notice how much energy they were giving away, how often they were prioritizing someone else's reality over their own. And with that awareness comes a quiet sense of strength, not loud or dramatic, but deeply rooted. It's the kind of strength that doesn't need validation, because it's not built on someone else's response. And as this internal shift continues, the distance between them and the narcissist becomes more than just physical or emotional. It becomes structural. They are no longer operating within the same framework, no longer playing the same roles, and that difference makes returning to the old dynamic not just unlikely, but almost impossible. Back on the other side, the narcissist may begin to sense this change more clearly now, even if they still don't fully understand it. There is a growing realization that the empath is not just distant, they are gone in a way that feels final. And that realization can trigger a different kind of response, one that isn't driven purely by control or habit, but by something closer to urgency. They may reach out again, this time with a tone that feels more genuine, more vulnerable than before. There can be apologies that seem deeper, acknowledgments that sound more sincere, even moments where they appear to truly reflect on what went wrong. And for anyone observing from the outside, it might look like a turning point, like a genuine attempt to change. But what makes this moment so complex is that it exists at the intersection of two completely different timelines. For the narcissist, this feels like the moment to fix things, to repair what has been lost. But for the empath, that moment has already passed. The time for understanding, for patience, for trying again, it all happened before, over and over, in ways that were never fully received. So when this late-stage vulnerability appears, it doesn't have the same impact it might have had before. The empath can see it, understand it, even feel a certain level of compassion for it, but they are no longer moved by it in the same way, because their decision was not based on a single incident and it cannot be reversed by a single gesture. And this is where the dynamic reaches its most defining shift, not in conflict, not in confrontation, but in indifference. The empath no longer feels the need to engage, to respond, to explain. There is no desire to prove a point, no need to be understood, no urge to reopen what has already been closed internally. And that indifference is something the narcissist struggles to process because it doesn't fit into any of the patterns they know how to navigate. They are used to being either admired or resisted, wanted or rejected. But to be met with calm, steady disengagement, without anger, without drama, feels like something entirely different. It feels like absence. And that absence carries a weight that is difficult to ignore, because it represents something they cannot easily recover from. The empath has not just stepped away from the relationship, they have stepped out of the emotional framework that sustained it. And in doing so, they have removed the last point of connection that the narcissist could rely on. What remains is not a broken bond waiting to be repaired, but an ended chapter that no longer seeks continuation. And in that quiet ending, both individuals are left facing very different paths. One moving toward clarity and self-definition, the other standing in the echo of something they can no longer control, trying to understand how something so constant could disappear without a fight. And in that echo, something begins to unravel that the narcissist can no longer ignore. Because for the first time, the silence isn't reacting to them. It's defining the entire atmosphere around them. It follows them into moments that used to feel effortless, into conversations that now feel slightly hollow, into reflections they've avoided for as long as they can remember. There is a subtle but persistent discomfort that starts to take shape, not loud enough to demand immediate attention, but strong enough to linger. It's the absence of something they once relied on without realizing it had become essential. And as that absence stretches over time, it becomes harder to dismiss. The usual distractions don't fully cover it, the new interactions don't completely replace it, and even when things appear normal on the surface, there's an underlying sense that something fundamental has shifted. This is the part that rarely gets talked about. The internal destabilization that occurs when someone who once provided constant emotional engagement is no longer present to absorb, reflect, and respond. The narcissist is left with more of themselves than they are used to handling, and without the familiar outlet of the empath's attention, that self becomes harder to avoid. It's not a clear confrontation at first. It's fragmented, indirect, almost intangible, but it's there, growing quietly in the background, shaping their perception in ways they can't fully control. In response to that discomfort, there may be a shift inward, but not necessarily in a healthy or conscious way. The narcissist might begin to withdraw slightly from others, not because they've suddenly become introspective, but because the external world no longer feels as predictable as it once did. The dynamics that used to work so seamlessly now require more effort, more calculation, more adjustment, and even then they don't produce the same results. This can lead to a kind of irritability that doesn't always have a clear source. Small things become more frustrating, interactions feel less satisfying, and there's a growing sense of impatience with anything that doesn't immediately restore that lost sense of control. At times, this frustration can turn outward, expressed through sharper words, colder behavior, or a subtle devaluation of others who don't meet the same emotional intensity the empath once provided. But at other times, it turns inward, creating a restlessness that is harder to express because it lacks a clear target. And in those quieter moments, when there is nothing to distract from it, the narcissist is left facing something unfamiliar, the possibility that the issue isn't external, but internal. It's not a fully formed realization, not a moment of clarity that suddenly changes everything, but it's a crack in the certainty they've always relied on. And even a small crack can alter the entire structure over time. While this internal tension continues to build, the empath is experiencing something that feels almost like stepping into a different reality altogether. The further they move away from the dynamic, the more they begin to recognize how much of themselves had been shaped around it. It's not just about the relationship, it's about the identity they held within it. The one who understood, who stayed, who gave, who tried. And as they step out of that role, there's a period of adjustment where they begin to ask questions they may have avoided before. Who are they when they're not constantly responding to someone else's needs? What do they feel when their emotions are not being redirected, explained, or managed in relation to someone else's behavior? These questions don't always have immediate answers, but they open a door to something deeper, self-awareness that is no longer filtered through another person's expectations. And within that awareness, there is both discomfort and freedom. Discomfort because it requires facing parts of themselves that may have been neglected. Freedom because it allows them to rebuild in a way that is no longer dependent on external validation. And as this process unfolds, something remarkable begins to happen. Their empathy doesn't disappear, but it becomes more grounded, more intentional. It is no longer something that is given endlessly without consideration. It becomes something they choose, something they protect, something they direct towards spaces and people where it is genuinely valued. Back on the other side of this separation, there may come a moment where the narcissist attempts one final return, but this time it carries a different tone. One that feels almost unfamiliar even to them. It's less about control and more about restoration, less about influence and more about reclaiming something that now feels irreplaceable. They may reach out with a level of openness that wasn't present before, expressing thoughts or emotions they would have previously avoided. There can be a sense of urgency beneath their words, a quiet recognition that this connection was not as interchangeable as they once believed. And for a brief moment, it might seem like something real is breaking through, like the possibility of change is finally within reach. But what makes this moment so complex is that it exists too late within the empath's timeline. The shift that needed to happen has already happened, but it happened within the empath, not the narcissist. And because of that, the same words that might have once reopened everything now land differently. The empath hears them, understands them, and may even feel a trace of what they once felt, but they are no longer anchored to it. They are no longer waiting for this moment to arrive. And without that waiting, without that emotional investment, the impact of the gesture fades before it can fully take hold. This is where the final transformation of the dynamic becomes undeniable, not through a dramatic ending, but through a quiet, steady absence of return. The empath does not re-engage, not out of bitterness or resentment, but out of clarity. They no longer feel the pull to fix what has already been understood. They no longer feel responsible for holding together something that required them to lose themselves in the process. And this absence of return is what ultimately defines what the narcissist becomes in this situation. Because without the empath's participation, without their emotional depth, without their willingness to absorb and respond, the narcissist is left with only two paths. Either to continue seeking that same dynamic elsewhere, repeating the pattern in a different form, or to remain in that silence long enough for it to reshape their awareness. And that second path is not easy. It requires sitting with discomfort, with uncertainty, with parts of themselves that have been avoided for a long time. It requires a level of honesty that cannot be forced and a willingness to see beyond the surface of their own behavior. Whether or not they choose that path is not something the empath can control, nor is it something they are responsible for anymore. Because the most important transformation has already taken place, not in what the narcissist becomes, but in what the empath no longer allows themselves to be. And what remains after that point is not a dramatic collapse, not a sudden awakening, but a long stretch of quiet where everything that once felt certain begins to feel strangely undefined. The narcissist is left standing in a reality that no longer responds to them in the same way, and that lack of response creates a kind of psychological vacuum. It's not loud, it doesn't demand immediate action, but it lingers in a way that's difficult to escape because it follows them into every interaction, every pause, every moment where they would have once expected a reaction and received none. Over time, this vacuum begins to reshape how they experience connection itself. What once felt like influence now feels like effort. What once felt like control now feels unstable. And beneath all of that, there is a quiet but persistent question forming, one they may not even consciously acknowledge. What happens when the person who used to reflect your importance no longer looks in your direction at all? It's a question that doesn't have an easy answer, because it forces them into a position they've rarely occupied, one where they are no longer the center of someone else's emotional world. And that shift, even if resisted, even if ignored, begins to leave its mark. For some, this becomes the beginning of a deeper internal conflict, one that doesn't resolve quickly or cleanly. The patterns that once defined their interactions don't simply disappear, but they start to feel less reliable, less effective, less fulfilling. There may be attempts to reinforce them, to double down on familiar behaviors in hopes of regaining that lost sense of stability, but each attempt carries a subtle awareness that something is different now, that the same actions no longer produce the same outcomes. And this awareness, even if it remains beneath the surface, begins to create tension between who they've always been and what they're now experiencing. It's not a transformation in the traditional sense, it's more like a slow erosion of certainty, where the edges of their identity begin to blur in ways they don't fully understand. And within that erosion lies a possibility, not a guarantee, not an inevitability, but a possibility that they might begin to see themselves more clearly, not through someone else's response, but through the absence of it. Whether they lean into that possibility or move away from it determines the direction they take, but the presence of that choice alone marks a significant shift. At the same time, the empath is moving further into a space that feels increasingly aligned with who they truly are, and the contrast between these two paths becomes more pronounced with each passing moment. What once felt like loss now reveals itself as release, not just from a person, but from a version of themselves that was constantly overextending, over-explaining, over-giving. There is a quiet strength in no longer feeling the need to chase understanding, in no longer trying to be seen by someone who never truly looked. And as that strength deepens, the empath begins to build something that isn't dependent on external validation or emotional reciprocity that only flows one way. They begin to trust their own perceptions, to honor their own limits, to recognize that their empathy is not a resource to be consumed endlessly, but a part of themselves that deserves to be protected and respected. This shift is not loud or dramatic, but it is profound, because it changes how they move through every interaction that follows. They are no longer drawn to the same dynamics, no longer compelled to fix what isn't theirs to fix, no longer willing to stay in spaces that require them to shrink in order to belong. And in that transformation, they become something the narcissist can no longer access, not because they are unreachable in a physical sense, but because they are no longer available in the way they once were. And that is where the deepest realization begins to take shape, even if it is never fully spoken aloud. The narcissist does not just lose a person, they lose a specific kind of connection that cannot be easily replaced. Because what the empath offered was not just attention or presence, but depth, patience, and a willingness to engage on a level that went beyond surface interaction. It was a connection that adapted, endured, and persisted even when it was not reciprocated in equal measure. And when that disappears, it leaves behind more than just absence. It leaves behind contrast. Every new interaction is measured against something that once existed, even if only unconsciously. And that comparison creates a subtle but ongoing dissatisfaction. It's not always obvious, it doesn't always disrupt their external life, but it exists in the background, shaping their perception in ways that can't be completely undone. And in that sense, what they become is not defined by a single outcome, but by an ongoing awareness, whether acknowledged or not, that something meaningful was lost, not because it wasn't available, but because it wasn't recognized in time. In the end, the story does not resolve itself in the way people often expect. There is no final confrontation, no definitive closure, no moment where everything is fully explained and understood by both sides. Instead, there are two separate evolutions that move in different directions, shaped by the same turning point but defined by entirely different choices. The narcissist becomes someone who must either continue navigating a world where their usual patterns feel increasingly unstable, or face the difficult process of self-examination that they have long avoided. The empath becomes someone who no longer abandons themselves in the name of connection, someone who understands that caring deeply does not mean caring endlessly, someone who has learned that the most powerful form of love is the kind that includes themselves. And the distance between these two paths is not marked by anger or resentment, but by something far more final: clarity. Because once you truly see a dynamic for what it is, once you understand the role you've been playing and choose to step out of it, there is no returning to it in the same way again. And that is the quiet, undeniable truth at the center of it all. When the empath stops caring, it is not the end of something fragile. It is the end of something that was never meant to last in its original form, and the beginning of something far more grounded, far more real, and far more aligned with who they were always meant to become.